Since this is some sort of interdisciplinary thing going on here, I'll be trying to showcase the kind of method that is quite popular in the tradition known as analytic philosophy, just kind of taken over the philosophical world in the last 100 years. And this is the way in which they try to study the history of philosophy. Of course, there's no homogeneous way that they do it, but one of the ways they try to do it, and it's called usually the method of rational reconstruction. The basic idea is that instead of trying to go to a historical figure and see what they think in their own terms, which obviously has its own place, has a lot of value, is kind of thing analytic philosophers kind of feed off. But instead of doing that, you try to explicitly go to them with your own concerns, contemporary concepts, contemporary questions, and kind of ask them questions as if they're like your colleague down the aisle. You go to them and say, what do you think about this? And see what kind of interesting answer you can get in this kind of interaction. So, since the method is a little funny, I thought it would be useful to showcase it to see how this kind of method can be fruitful and productive for progress in philosophy. So here's the plan. First, I'm going to introduce a contemporary puzzle in philosophy and mention certain things about its framing. Then I'm going to go to medieval philosopher, Iranian philosopher, al-Suhrawardi, and talk about his epistemology of imagination, also some heavy dose of Avicenna there. And then I'm going to conclude by noting how these two things relate to each other. This is a little bit of an ambitious talk, so I might have to skip certain parts of it, and it is also a lot of it is work in progress, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, the kind of philosophical problem I'm interested in, it goes under the broad heading of moral epistemology, where the basic question is, what is the nature of moral knowledge, or how is moral knowledge possible? In contemporary philosophy, that is in modern philosophy, there are two main camps that have tried to answer this question. One is moral rationalism, one is moral empiricism. So according to moral rationalism, it's on the handout, moral knowledge is like mathematical or logical knowledge. So what it takes to know moral obligations, moral norms, is similar to the kind of reflection we do in mathematics or logic. You think about first principles of morality, you try to derive further obligations from it. For instance, if you're a consequentialist, you think about maximizing happiness is the kind of thing you have to do, and then you kind of try to drive further obligations from it. In my short philosophical career, my PhD was on Immanuel Kant, who is perhaps the representative, the most systematic and most powerful representative of moral rationalism in modern philosophy. I have a quote from him there, let me read this. So here's how he's kind of trying to sell his philosophical work. He says, whoever knows what a formula means to a mathematician, which determines quite precisely what is to be done to solve a problem and does not let him miss it, will not take a formula that does this with respect to all duty in general as something that is insignificant and can be dispensed. So he's thinking of his project in this kind of very rationalistic kind of idea that I'm going to give you a first principle of reason, principle of practical reason. Any moral question you have, what should I do? That question can be answered in principle at least by some sort of rational derivation from that first principle. But here's the problem with this kind of picture. I mean, there are many problems with it, but I'm just going to focus on one of them for now. As Kant himself sometimes points out, even if I knew all the set of principles that are the rational principles of morality, it won't be obvious what I should do in particular situations given particular relations. So suppose I know all the general principles that if such and such conditions hold, if a person is unhappy and you are in a position of some power to make them happy, then do such and such. That could be a general principle I could do. No. But that would not answer the knowledge question about what I should do given what is in front of my nose. Given that I know Austin, I know he's unhappy, what constitutes his happiness, how should I but should I apply that particular rule, or should I apply the rule that might apply to Yasin? Which rule is going to be the relevant rule? That's going to remain an open question. And Kant himself acknowledges in a number of places that that question, the question of application of the universal law to particular situation, that cannot be answered by reason itself. So Kant 2 on the handout, he says, reason gives to him, this is the person, as a rational being, laws a priori, which no doubt still require judgment sharpened by experience, partly to distinguish in what cases they are applicable, and partly to provide them with access, although he is capable of the idea of a practical pure reason, is not so easily able to make it effective in concreto in the conduct of his life. So when it comes to actual moral questions, the moral knowledge that's at stake there, the rationalists have a very hard time accounting for that. How do we know which rule applies to which situation? So given that, you might be, and a lot of philosophers were, tempted to go with a rival view, moral empiricism. Roughly the idea that moral knowledge is a kind of knowledge that is empirical or observation-based, in the same way that you might think knowledge of psychology, knowledge of social sciences, knowledge of human behavior is observational knowledge. You look at people, you learn how they act in certain situations, you look at social relations, you learn about how social relations and social norms work. However, moral empiricism also has its own problems. Many of them are familiar. Here I just note maybe the most famous problem is a quote from David Hume where he says, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, the author proceeds from some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, makes observation concerning human affairs. Then of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual calculation of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or ought not. So the worry there is that what empiricists can do, what empirical observation can do, is can tell us how human psychology does work, how social relations are, how we do interact with each other. But the thing that you can't derive from it, and that's the moral question, is how we ought to work, how we ought to manage our psychology, how we ought to manage our social interactions. But at least the claim is that just by having observations, you can't get to the ought claims. There's something extra needed. And the problem with empiricism is, what is that extra thing? What is that thing that connects us to general values, to general principles? So, in short, we can say that this is a very big brush, but in modern moral philosophy, we have two kind of views about moral knowledge. One is this reason-based conception of moral knowledge, where what is at stake is knowledge of abstract and universal principles and values, or this kind of perception-based, this kind of sensibility-based conception of moral knowledge. But what is at stake is knowledge of concrete and particular relations and events and social kind of institutions and so on. Now, that's of course a big brush, but it does suggest that there might be a framing problem. There's a problem with the way in which things have been set up. And the purpose of this talk is that if you go down the hall and talk to Suhrawardi might point out to you that, yes, there is a framing problem. There is this kind of assumption that knowledge is either rational or reason-based or observational, based on perception. And there's a third kind of knowledge that Suhrawardi thinks is possible, which is going to be this kind of imaginative knowledge, or knowledge through imagination. Now, Now, this idea that imagination can be a source of knowledge is not foreign to modern philosophy. While modern philosophers do talk about imagination as a source of knowledge, but almost universally, almost really without any exception, they think of imagination as a secondary source of knowledge, as a source of knowledge when things are not ideal, when we really can't do better. So consider this passage to see how this kind of gets set up. This is from Amy Kind and Peter Kuhn. They say imagination is sometimes used to enable us to escape or look beyond the world as it is, as when we daydream or fantasize or pretend. Yet imagination is also sometimes used to enable us to learn about the world as it is, as when we plan or make decisions or make predictions about the future. But how can a single mental activity successfully be put to both uses? So the puzzle is called the puzzle of imaginative use in contemporary philosophy. The thought is, how can the same faculty that gets us to fantasies and daydreaming be reliably a source of knowledge, be a reliable source of knowing how things are in the world? And the puzzle is often answered by this kind of, one more thing. Another way to put it is the way that Hume has put it, that imagination seems to have just too much freedom. As under the too much freedom thing on the first page of handout, as I told Hume, to form monsters and join incongruous shapes and appearances cost the imagination no more trouble than to conceive the most natural and familiar objects. And that's supposed to be contrasted with perception and reason. So even if I try very hard, I can't try to see this as an elephant. I can imagine it as an elephant. That doesn't seem to take that much trouble. But perception seems to be constrained by evidence. It's sensitive to truth. And reason, likewise, if you point out to me that something is irrational, it results in contradiction, I really have to do some sort of psychological maneuvering of magic to try to believe otherwise. But imagination seems to kind of fly free from evidence and from considerations of truth. So the solution that has been offered, this is just to point out how imagination has been conceived in contemporary philosophy, is this view of constrained imagination. So the thought is that although by default imagination is not sensitive to truth, we can, under certain contexts, put a voluntary constraints on it that imagine things your imagination is supposed to be sensitive in truth in the sense that if you know that your imagination is not getting you to truth, you take that episode of imagining to be a bad episode of imagining. There are two examples. A common example is the car seat example. So you want to imagine whether the car seat fits in the back of the car. So this kind of imagining is sensitive to truth that when you're imagining it, you're trying to get things right. You put a constraint on it that now I'm not imagining to kind of form monsters and so on, but I really want to get it right. So that's one kind of imagining that seems to get us to knowledge, maybe in good cases. And there's kind of cases in mathematics you can think about. So if you want to know whether you can get triangles out of a circle, you can imagine a circle, try to see if it's possible to kind of cut it in a certain way that you get triangles out of it. And if you go right, it shows that through imagination you learn that you can't do that. But in both cases, imagination is kind of the core puzzle here. In the car seat case, if you could actually go and see it, perception would have been the ideal way to know whether or not the car seat fits there. And in the geometrical case, in the ideal case, you just do a geometrical proof, we do algebraic geometry and show that such and such cannot be done. I don't know that much geometry. My mom was a geometry teacher, I should know more. But basically, in that sense, that's a sense in which imaginative knowledge becomes a secondary form of knowledge. It's a concession to our flawed nature. And if I could see things, everything like God, you can see everything. I could just know things by seeing, but given that I can't do that, I'm going to use imagination. Or if I could just do all the proofs in the world, I would just follow the process of reasoning. But given that I can't do that, I'm just going to imagine how circles and triangles relate to each other. Okay, so that's the kind of contemporary picture that I was saying is kind of at the background of the debate in moral epistemology. Put it differently, while moral epistemologists have focused on either morality is a purely rational based account or a purely perceptual kind of based account or a combination of two, but don't bring imagination into picture. The reason is that imagination is taken to be something that we could more or less reduce it to either perception or reason. It's not something that in itself is a source of knowledge. Now, change of gears, gonna go to medieval Islamic philosophy. And just to anticipate the thing we're gonna see here, first of all, it's gonna be quite kooky. It's kind of a very specific medieval kind of problem. And it's not going to be obvious how it can be extracted and applied to this other debate. I'll do my best to see why I think there might be an interesting relation. Okay. So I said the problem that we're going to be dealing with is kind of cookie because it has to do with a very specific theory of afterlife that Avicenna, the kind of the greatest Islamic philosopher, introduced. And the background is this, that Avicenna was quite big on the non-kind of orthodox view that afterlife is not going to be embodied. Afterlife is a form of experience, is a form of consciousness, is a form of awareness. Put it in different kind of loosely related terms. And he thought that the select, the prophets, the sages and so on, because they cultivate their soul in the right way during this life, when they die, they're going to have the highest form of kind of contemplation, the highest form of awareness, which is contemplation of the universals and the intellectual kind of objects. So, to put it kind of some examples on it. So, the sages would be contemplating the idea of beauty, the form of beauty, the form of grace. You could have this kind of, the forms, you can identify them maybe with the 99 names of God and so on. So, but what would be the object of their attention is going to be this universal idea and this universal form. So, this kind of Abyssinian philosophical conception of heaven. To be in heaven is to be like the philosopher who is really thinking about this concept and is having a complete understanding of these concepts. And the intellectual joy is the joy that is related to the joy of heaven. So that was the conception he had of heaven. But the problem was that that was only for the select. How about losers like us, who have not done the full activation of our intellect to know all the universal forms? In order to kind of account for that other kind of awareness of afterlife, he needed to postulate another form of awareness, which is not pure intellectual awareness of the universals. But he couldn't account for this in terms of sensation, because he insisted that sensation or perception is this kind of physical thing that we have in this world. It's really related to our brains, our sense organs, and so on. So the question for him was, how do we think about the awareness that the non-select have, like you and I have in the afterlife? I mean, there might be stages here, but the rest of us, the thought was that are going to be aware of what we're going to have an afterlife in which we imagine. We will be imagining things. We're going to be aware of things that are imagined. Now, there were a couple of problems with this view. And because of that, the view was very unpopular at first. Even his biggest followers were not really adhering to this part of his view of afterlife. There's a lot of them. But Suhrawardi, though he's quite critical of Avicenna, is going to take this view up. He's going to, in some version, he's going to accept it. But part of the problem was that, firstly, was his conception of imagination. So this is kind of internal to his philosophical account. Required that in order to imagine, you need to take up some of the material that have been given to you in sensation, and then you kind of recompose and reconstruct what you have imagined to get the object of imagination. But given that you're dead, you don't have the sense organs and you don't have the brain to kind of recollect, that's going to be that kind of problem, how you make sense of that. So there was an internal problem, and there was a kind of more religious external problem that on this account, it sounds like maybe the select are going to have a real awareness of something real when they are kind of intellectualizing about the universals. But the rest of us seem to be fantasizing about things that are not real. There's no kind of real cognition going on when you're imagining things when you're not one of the selects. Now, I'm not going to really spend, that's all I'm going to say about the problems with this, but first thing I'm going to note already, because time is kind of going fast, is that here's the shape of a problem we're starting to see, that there is a certain form of cognition of particulars, of concrete things that are in front of our nose, the kind of the nose, the things that you sense, the things that you perceive. And there is a higher form, perhaps, a kind of a somehow more valuable form of awareness of the universals, the ideas of beauty, the ideas of knowledge, friendship, etc. And he literally needs to make sense of the transition from here to there, something that connects this form of cognition in this world, to the ideal kind of cognition. We need to have an account of what is in between. And imagination is introduced as this kind of the medium through which you can go kind of travel between these two things. So that's kind of the general hint that it's going to be motivating the kind of account I'm trying to get from this medieval account. Maybe, so in order to, so I have set my conclusion before if I run out of time. So the picture is going to be that the kind of account of moral knowledge we're trying to get between these two camps of moral philosophy that we're talking about. One is concerned with absolute kind of ideal moral principles, the moral principles of, say, justice, having a pure will, pure goodwill, etc. That's the kind of the rationalist kind of way of thinking about morality. And the moral empiricist account has been trying to account for our moral sensibility as we interact with each other in the business of life, that the very particular relationship I have with, let's say, Austin. But the problem is trying to kind of find a bridge between these two, trying to make sense of the way in which general moral values, universal moral principles, relate to particular relations that we have. And the features of imagination that Suhrawardi and Hadisi are going to point out, to kind of highlight, are features that suggest that imagination has this unique function of making knowledge of particular objects related to knowledge of universals. So that's kind of the general shape. But let's get to Suhrawardi now. That was the promised title of the talk. So this is the part of the talk. I don't know how much of it I can explain clearly. If anything has been clear so far, this is going to be, things really going to go downhill at this point. But let's see. So, like many philosophers in the tradition, Suhrawardi was happy to account for two kinds of existences. I mean, three, but the sole existences are on the handout, are not very relevant for us for right now. But two kinds of objects in the world. One is objects that are kind of the universals, the Platonic forms. So, for instance, the idea of beauty that can be treated as a thing that exists in itself is separate from each specific beautiful thing. Or the idea of knowledge, the idea of even like a speech, like say humanity, it's an idea that he is happy to say that we can make sense of it as a thing that exists as an object. To say that it exists as an object doesn't mean it like, has a spatial location and so on. All it means is that it's a kind of thing that we can make sense of it as existing independently of mind. So this kind of mind independence of this kind of, or we can think of its properties as properties that are independent of our mind. Now, so that's the kind of thing we can talk about. So this is what he calls the intellects or the dominating lights. And he also is happy to account for concrete particular objects in this world that are kind of become the bodies, what he calls the barriers. These are objects that just complete the spatio-temporal objects that have finite temporal extension and finite spatial extension. Now, Suhrawardi's innovation is going to be that it's going to say that if you want to account for these two kinds of objects and how they relate to each other, you need to account for a third kind of object, which he calls suspended images, and another kind of world, imaginal existence that is somehow evolving between the world of the universals and the world of the particulars. Now, how do we get there? What are all these terms mean? Okay. So I'm going to start this on the second page of handout on question 3. What are the Suhrawardian imaginal existences or the suspended images? This is, it is a rough thing to do because he's trying to account for a kind of object that is neither this kind of familiar philosophical object of Platonic forms, nor this familiar kind of commonsensical object of concrete world, something in between. And he calls them the suspended images. So let's start with a quote from al-Suhrawardi on 3AI. So these suspended images are not the forms of Plato, for the forms of Plato are luminous and fixed. And later he's going to say these suspended images are sometimes luminous and sometimes dark. And sometimes they're transitional and they're sometimes somewhat fixed. So the thing we need to make sense of, what the hell do these terms mean, these kind of technical terms. Bad news is that this term luminous is extremely controversial, how to make sense of the notion of luminosity that he attributes to different objects. Here's a rough approximation that I'm suggesting. So the thought is going to be that an object is luminous. It has this kind of property of light, just in case it determines its own meaning and other objects' meanings. What's the thought? So let me say the contrast and I can give an example. An object is dark, just in case its meaning is fully determined by other luminous objects. What is going on there? So here's the thought. Take the object, the Platonic form of beauty. The thought is that that object, if you can make sense of this existence, is mind-independent existence. Determines the meaning of what beauty is. It's a kind of a self-determining kind of meaning determiner. And also it determines the meaning of particular beautiful things in the world. So if I'm beautiful, which I am, my meaning, insofar as I'm beautiful, my meaning is determined by that object. So that's in that sense, I'm a dark object that what significance I have, what value can be attributed to me, what meaning can be attributed to me is in virtue of that other object. But the object beauty itself is an object that is, as he puts it, it's the dominant light. It's a light that kind of determines its own meaning, it determines what beauty is, and it determines what other things are beautiful in the world. So, to say, to put this in Suhrawardi's terms, he wants to say that imaginal objects, I'm running out of time, I'm going to summarize quickly. Imaginal objects are objects that are neither like concrete objects in the world that all their meaning is determined by certain other kind of forms. So the thought is that if you just look at me as a material concrete thing, any meaning you want to attribute to me, any meaning you want to bestow to me, has to be in virtue of some other lights, some other object that is a meaning signifier or meaning determiner. So for instance, in virtue of being a human, it's going to be in virtue of the form human. Being a bald bull, and in virtue of baldness, and so on. So these kind of different properties are going to be determining who I am. But, so these are the concrete objects, and the Platonic forms kind of, they're pure lights. The imaginal objects are supposed to be in between, in the sense that partially, to some, in kind of, you could say, given certain domains, they determine their own meaning and determine the meaning of other things. And partially their meaning is determined by universal forms. So how does this go? Consider the form of a triangle. So the thought is, you can think about the Platonic form of a triangle. It has certain features and it determines itself. So if you know the form, you know what triangleness means. And if you know it, you can determine like particular things in the world that are triangle. But compare that to when I imagine a triangle. So I kind of close my eyes and imagine a triangle. The triangle that I imagine is not the Platonic form in the sense that its properties are not fully determined by itself. Its properties, it has the properties it has in virtue of a relationship to the form of triangle. At the same time, it has certain properties that, it has properties in virtue of which I can say things about the objects in this world. So it kind of, it gets some light from the universal kind of concepts, gets some meanings from them, but I can use it as a general triangle. The imagined triangle is not any particular triangle that I see in this world. It's an object that I can use to kind of bring other objects under it. Does that make some sense? Okay. 29 minutes, so I go 5 more minutes. How the hell is this going to solve the puzzle of afterlife, first of all? Well, this has to, I mean, the way in which this is going to solve the puzzle of afterlife is going to be how Suhrawardi thinks these imaginal objects, these objects that are kind of a concretization of a universal form. So you can say that when I do this, what does that mean? So maybe an analogy here is going to help. Consider a painting, let's say Mona Lisa. When you look at Mona Lisa, one way to think about what goes on to know the object of the painting is to say that, well, you have perception. You see certain concrete objects in the world that are kind of objects of your perception. But importantly, the art object, the object that is known as the artwork, is not the same thing as the object that is kind of on the canvas alone. It's like just having the perception in which of that alone, you don't have a kind of an access to the object that is the object of imagination. Suhrawardi's kind of tweaking of Avicenna's idea is now this. Avicenna thought that whenever you have access to an object of imagination, you have to kind of, in a way, close your eyes and reproduce the object in your head. So, to know the artwork of Mona Lisa, after you look at it, in a sense, you have to kind of close your eyes and create the object in your head. Then you have access to the imagined object. So, to the whatever Mona Lisa is supposed to be represented. But Suhrawardi's thought was that imagination can take different vehicles. Sure, sometimes the vehicle of imagination is in our head. So when you imagine, you have to kind of close your eyes and you can fantasize about things. But in the case of Mona Lisa, for instance, the vehicle of imagination is the painting itself. If you're not looking at the painting, you're not looking at the imagined object. So the act of looking at the imagined object, you can call it a double movement. Is in one sense is seeing the object as a set of perception. In another way is to taking that concrete object to be a standing for an imaginal object, an object that is kind of bearer of meaning and bearer of value, etc. This is supposed to help Suhrawardi's account of afterlife. This is the part that really gets funny. It has to do with the idea that in afterlife we're going to go to the realms of celestial bodies. Celestial bodies are kind of like these imaginal objects. You don't need anymore to be kind of having a mind of your own to produce imaginal objects, which you don't have anymore because you've lost your brain and so on. You are in presence of this kind of imaginal objects. These imaginal objects, it would be similar to be in presence of analysis. Like there's an object there, it has imaginal content, it has a content that has some value and some meaning to it. And in virtue of being in presence of these celestial bodies, you're going to have certain kind of experience that is the actual experience of a genuine thing. So, that's how he solves the medieval puzzle. But now to extract and to get to how is it going to kind of help us with thinking about cases of moral knowledge. The kind of picture I think we can extract from this is to put in terms of the contrast. With the Kantian model of moral knowledge, the rationalist model, we were trying to model moral knowledge, what it is to know moral things, on mathematical sciences. So you know rational principles, you kind of apply rational principles to specific cases. With the kind of mirroring John Strauss kind of model, the empiricist model I was talking about, you try to model it on the basis of natural scientific kind of knowledge. You do observations, you see a certain sort of behavior, and you make generalization about what behavior is right or wrong. But with the Suhrawardi kind of account, the idea is that we could make sense of a certain kind of knowledge which is very similar to aesthetic knowledge. So the thought could be that when I see Austin slapping Yasin, what I see, what I perceive is just a certain kind of like physical interaction taking place. But it is going to be in virtue of imagination that I can relate that perception of a particular thing to an imaginal kind of object. So this imaginal object will be the object of a person harming another person in this kind of particular kind of context. And so to have moral knowledge, to know what coming to do moral evaluation is going to be having this kind of aesthetic training, in kind of imaginative training, to know what kind of value, what kind of meaning should I ascribe to the things that I'm perceiving. In that sense, the interesting result is going to be that, say, moral education is not going to be so much as conceivers, a kind of education in being able to reflect on moral principles, or so much as Mill suggests, some sort of making observations about the world in this kind of empirical way. But it's going to be a lot more similar to a cultivation of imagination. It's going to require cultivating ways of realizing how certain concrete objects could stand in relationship to certain imaginal kind of objects. So that's kind of an interesting avenue that I think this kind of medieval conception of a knowledge between the rational knowledge and the perceptual knowledge can present to us. I'm not going to talk about the second thing because I think I'm out of time. Perfect. That's it.